Great. Okay. So hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me back again today and to talk to you this time about diabetes. The last time I spoke to you about dementia, and I felt it was a wonderful session. I had some amazing questions, so I hope today will be much the same. Um, Today, as I mentioned, I'm going to be talking about diabetes, and I'll start off just introducing myself in case you've forgotten me or you weren't here for the last session. My name is Sundhya. I'm a medical doctor. I also have a PhD in genetics, and I'm qualified in lifestyle medicine with the International Board of Lifestyle Medicine and the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine. And I also have a number of different roles. So I work as a lifestyle medicine doctor at a company I founded called My Wellness Doctor. I'm the diabetes lead at an organization called Plant-Based Health Online. And I also do some work with NHS England. And I'm also the lifestyle medicine lead at the Primary Care Cardiovascular Society. And really what I do there is I create teaching for healthcare professionals, and I train them in lifestyle changes to prevent and reverse cardiovascular disease. And as I mentioned the last time I was here, I'm here on behalf of a wonderful organization called Plant-Based Health Professionals. They're a community interested company, which means all the money that they get, they reinvest into community kind of initiatives like education and things. Their membership isn't just for healthcare professionals. And even if you're not a member, they have wonderful resources on their website, which I have here, which are written by healthcare professionals. So doctors, nutritionists, dietitians. So it's very reliable and evidence-based information. So now back to diabetes. Now, diabetes is a topic very close to my heart because it is the whole reason that I became a lifestyle medicine doctor. And it began with my mum and my dad, who are pictured here. So my mum and my dad both have diabetes, but it was my dad in particular who really suffered with the consequences of diabetes. So he was diagnosed when he was in his 40s. And by the time he was in his 50s, he had to have open heart surgery because there was so much disease in the blood vessels supplying his heart that they were very clogged up with fatty deposits. By the time he was in his 60s, he had more procedures to open up those blood vessels supplying his heart. So he had stenting done into those blood vessels for his heart, and he started to lose his vision. He started to get damage to his eyes. By the time he was in his 70s, he was completely blind from diabetes. And this meant that in practice, he never saw the faces of 3 of his 4 grandchildren, and he completely lost his independence. And of course, my mum lost her independence because she became his carer. And what that really meant was, at a time in their lives when they should be enjoying financial freedom, they should be enjoying their retirement, they should be enjoying their children and their grandchildren, they were mainly going back and forth to hospital. They were struggling with normal days, normal activities of daily life because he couldn't see. He couldn't even find his way around his own house. And that was very tough for my mum as well. And last year, finally, he did unfortunately pass away because eventually his heart failed. So this is a topic that's very close to my heart. And it wasn't until, now, if you look at my immediate family, this is my family tree. So my mum, my dad, and my sister are there in orange. They all have diabetes. I'm there in green. I don't have diabetes. And when you look at my extended family, both sets of grandparents, nearly all my aunts and uncles, all with diabetes. And this is probably not uncommon. This is probably most of the people here probably have similar family trees. Now, my entire family are typically lifelong vegetarians. They tend not to be obese. They cook from scratch. Only 2 of them have ever been smokers. They do so many things right. So where has it all gone wrong? And it wasn't until my mum's youngest brother came to me. Now, he was only 50, and he had been diabetic for 12 years by now. And for 4 years, the previous 4 years, his kidneys were showing signs of damage from diabetes. But when his eyes now started showing signs of damage, he became very worried. He didn't want to end up like my father. So he came to me and he said, "What more can I be doing? So what I'm going to be talking about with you today is what I learned when I went back to the science. And hopefully at the end of this talk, if you are worried about diabetes, either for yourself or for a loved one, you'll be able to take some information away and hopefully have better health outcomes than my dad. So I'm going to start out by just giving an outline of why diabetes happens in anybody. And then I'm going to focus a little bit more on why we as a community are more likely to get diabetes. Is there anything we can do to prevent or reverse diabetes? And finally, I'll end with some special tips that I think any of us in our community can take home and practice in our real lives. So why does diabetes happen in the first place? Now, the explanation we are typically given is that we're eating too much food, too many calories, particularly the types of food that get broken down in our bodies into sugar. And we call these kinds of foods carbohydrate. So they're things like our chapati, rice, bread, pasta. So not just sugary foods and drinks like our desserts and Coca-Cola, but all of these kinds of foods that get broken down into sugars. Now, what we normally do is any energy that we don't use straight away from these foods, we store, and we store them in a sort of quick access savings account as glycogen in our muscle and our liver, right? Now, when those stores get filled up, we convert it into fat. And this fat also gets stored in our muscle and our liver, but it gets stored around other places as well. So it gets stored in our pancreas and around our tummies. Now, it isn't just stored. So this fat isn't simply inactive and just a storage of fat. Fat is quite damaging when it's stored around our organs. It makes our cells very stressed and it damages our cells. So they become what we describe as insulin resistant. I'm going to just explain what insulin does right now. So if you think about whenever we eat, that is the equivalent of ordering a food shop from a supermarket, yeah? So we order that food and it travels along the road in the delivery van, and that's like being transported in our blood vessels. And then it should reach our house, our doors need to open, and the food needs to come into our house, and that's where it can be used. The analogy there is that when we eat food, it should be transported in our blood vessels, and then it's no good in our blood vessels, the same as it's no good in that delivery van. It has to then get into the cells where it can be used as energy. What insulin does is it's like a doorman. It opens the door to our cells to let the energy, to let the sugars out of the bloodstream where they cause damage and into our cells where they are useful. That's the equivalent of the food coming in the delivery van. We don't want it staying in the delivery van. In fact, if it got stuck there, it would start to rot and cause problems. And it's the same thing. If we leave the sugar in our blood vessels, it starts to cause inflammation and damage there. So insulin is like the doorman. It lets the energy into the cells. Now, supposing our front door became warped and stiff and we can't open it. This is the same as insulin resistance. So what happens is we're unable to get the energy, the sugars out of our blood and into our cells. They're not listening when the signal comes. Look, the food is here, let it into the cell. And so what happens is our pancreas makes insulin. And so what it says is we need to push this door a little bit harder. We need to get the energy in there. So it makes more insulin. And that's the equivalent of forcing more and more doormen to push the door open. Eventually, they can get that stiff door open. The problem with insulin, when we get more and more insulin getting into our blood, is it's great. It gets the energy out of our blood and into our cells, but it has two other effects. One, it makes us hungry, so we eat even more calories. And two, it makes us store fat. So we end up with this vicious cycle of producing more fat, putting those around our organs, making everything insulin resistant, and then the pancreas having to make more insulin. And this cycle goes on and on for years and years and years until finally we can't make enough insulin to open the door to the cells to let the sugar out of the blood and into the cells. And that is when we become diabetic. So it's this vicious cycle many, many years before we become diabetic that's going on in our bodies until we decompensate and then we become diabetic. So if we look at us as a community and you took any person who was a normal, healthy weight, and you took one Caucasian person and one Indian person, what you would find is even at a normal, healthy weight, the Asian person is going to be 5 times more likely to become diabetic. We tend to develop diabetes at a younger age compared to Caucasians. And once we are diabetic, we are much more likely to have damage to our blood vessels, the ones in our heart. So we're more likely to have heart problems, the ones in our eyes, so we're more likely to go blind, the ones in our kidneys, so we're more likely to have kidney problems, the ones in our fingers and toes, so we're more likely to have problems with feeling the sensation in our fingers and toes. And we're also more likely to die from diabetes. So it's really a very serious diagnosis for us, and it's a much higher risk for us. But still, why do we have such a high risk? Well, one of the first clues came from the work of these 2 men, and they defined something called the why paradox. And the why and the why come from their surnames. So John Yudkin was an obesity expert at UCL in London, and Chittaranjan Yajnik was a diabetes expert in Pune in India. And one thing we do to see if somebody, one measure we use to see if somebody is the right weight for their height is we use a calculation called the BMI, or body mass index, which is a function of of your weight compared to your height. And this is how we calculate it. And this is how we define if somebody is underweight, a normal weight, or overweight. And what they found is both of these men, they had an identical BMI of 22.3, which is a healthy and normal BMI. But then they went into a body scanner and they looked at what their body composition was. How much of that is fat? How much of that is muscle? And what they found was they had very different body compositions. So John Yudkin was very athletic. He ran marathons, and his body fat percentage was only just over 9% of his entire body weight. Chittaranjan Yajnik, on the other hand, he, by his own admission, never exerted himself. So he appeared slim, but the most exercise he ever took, he said, was to run, to catch the lift so that he didn't have to take the stairs in his hospital at work. And that's as much exercise he would do. And so when he went in the body scanner, his body fat percentage was more than double that of his friend and colleague, Dr. Yudkin. And this was the first clue. And this is common to us in general, which is that we have a phenomenon called normal weight obesity. What that means is, whilst we don't look like we are overweight, we don't look like we are heavy, we are putting on fat around our organs long before it is apparent that we are overweight. And then when we finally start to put on a bit of weight, we put it on around our tummies. And our tummy fat behaves differently to fat that you put on your hips and on your thighs. It is more insulin resistant. And that fat stored around our organs is causing that stress to all these different tissues, and it's making them insulin resistant. So we don't deal well with fat. We don't deal well with putting on weight. We put it on badly, and it's more damaging to us. So for example, if you took 2 women who are both 5'2", and one of them is Caucasian and one is Asian, the Caucasian one can deal with an extra 5 kilograms of weight at the same height compared to her Indian counterpart before she will have the same risk of developing diabetes. If you took 2 men who are 5'10", the Caucasian man can be a good 6 kilograms heavier than the Asian man before he starts to increase his risk of developing diabetes. The other thing about our body composition is we tend to have a lower muscle mass compared with Caucasians. Now, muscle mass, you may remember from when I was earlier describing about what happens when we eat. We store some of our energy in our muscle in our liver. So actually, our muscles are a really important place in which we store our energy in a safe way. So it stores about 70% of our glucose when we eat. Now, we naturally lose muscle mass with age. And so it's really important. And we know this is true for quite a range of chronic health problems. So when I gave my dementia talk, another important thing was maintaining muscle mass. So we naturally lose muscle mass with age. So it's really important to try and incorporate some resistance stuff, using maybe resistance bands or yoga, which makes a demand on your body to hold positions. So it is demanding on your muscles. But even lifting weights, this may seem like a strange thing to do. It is culturally not that common in our community to do that, but it's something we need to start thinking about if we want to have healthy aging. So is any of it just purely genetic and something that we can't help? So yes, we do have a certain proportion of our risk of diabetes that tends to be more common amongst Asians, but that contribution is very, very small. The very vast contribution are things like how much we store fat and how much muscle mass we have that affects our metabolism. And this is down to our lifestyle. So our lifestyles, even though when you look at my family tree, it may look very genetic, but actually we don't just share our genes, we share our behaviors, we share our diet, we share our lifestyles. And so things that we think run in families because of our genes are actually often because of our lifestyles. But there's more to it than that, and I'll come to that in a minute. So as a community, we do many, many things really, really well. We have a wonderful cuisine full of wonderful variety of colors and types of fruit and vegetables, nuts, legumes, seeds, spices. All of these things are incredibly good for us and very healthy. But there are some things we could be doing differently to improve our health. So, for example, we fry some of our breads. And what this does is it spikes up our sugars at a very, very quick rate. And it causes that chemical reaction has a lot of components that are quite damaging, and they cause a lot of inflammation in our blood vessels. The other thing is we know that white rice increases our risk of diabetes. So it's a form of processing. When we remove that brown layer in rice, we lose about 80 to 90% of the fiber and nearly all of the vitamins in rice. And we're starting to increase our blood sugars in a very sharp spike. So if at the moment you eat white rice, I would say try 50% and slowly increase that percentage until you're eating brown rice. It takes longer to cook, but I think it's delicious. I don't think you'll miss it after a while and once you get used to it. But we really also should be always aiming for whole grain flours and don't fry our breads. The other thing is we add a lot of fat to our foods that is not good for us. So we add a lot of dairy fat, animal fat to our foods, and we know that this raises our bad cholesterol, and the combination of becoming insulin resistant and having a high cholesterol is incredibly damaging for our blood vessels. And also our desserts are both very sugary, creamy, buttery, fatty, and these are really, really damaging. Again, it's that mixture of making us insulin resistant and raising our bad cholesterol. And this is a real disaster for our blood vessels. And actually, this damage to our blood vessels is the biggest risk for anybody who is diabetic. One thing that I really need to point out in particular is when I gave this explanation of why diabetes happened, this is what we commonly use to describe how diabetes happens. But actually, it's a very oversimplified explanation of diabetes because food isn't just calories or fat or protein, all these things. In reality, food is information. And when we eat food, it is translated in our bodies into information by three main mechanisms that either set us on a path to a long and healthy life, or they set us on a path towards developing a chronic disease. And these are those three mechanisms. And don't worry, I know there's some very odd words in there, but I'm going to explain what each of these are. So the first of these at the top is called epigenetics. The second is inflammation. And the third is our microbiome. So I'll start off with epigenetics. So our genetics, our genes, our DNA, our genetic code is the manual to make every component of a human being. And this is very, very stable, and it doesn't change. It would take hundreds of generations to change our genetic code. It is very stable. But we have little tags on our genes that either switch that gene on or switch that gene off. We inherit these tags. We inherit them from our parents, our grandparents, or even our great-grandparents. And this may be why my family tree makes it look like this diabetes is genetic. In many cases, I have inherited those tags that put me at a higher risk of developing diabetes from various generations. But what's very interesting about how these tags are formed is we can change them with our behaviors. So as I mentioned before, we don't just inherit our genes from our families, we inherit our lifestyles. We inherit the way we eat from our families. This is how we learn to cook, we learn to eat. We have families who are very strong on exercise and so on, and other families that aren't. So this makes it look like things are inevitable in our families, but they're often not. So in my case, I find it very encouraging that by changing my behaviors, I can reshape these tags that are on my genes. The second thing I've mentioned here is inflammation. Now, inflammation is a normal process in our body. So for example, if I were to cut my skin, it would get red, and it would get hot, and it would get painful. And this is inflammation because what it is doing, it is calling all the emergency services. It's saying, hey, immune system, come here, deal with any infection. Clotting system, come here, deal with the cut, heal everything. But this whole process should be short term, and then it is appropriate and it is healthy. The thing that we see with nearly every chronic disease is that there is a long process of a grumbling low level of inflammation. So we see this in heart disease, we see this in diabetes, we see this in many cancers, we see this in dementia. And it's a low level of grumbling inflammation that we can't shut down. And this puts stress on our cells over a long period of time until eventually they can't cope anymore. And then we end up with a disease. The final thing is our microbiome. So a microbiome is basically just a community of bacteria, yeast, and fungi. So they're just small little bugs that live actually all around our body. We coexist with them. They live on our skin, they live in our mouth, they live in our lungs, they live all over our bodies. The one that's particularly interesting is the one that lives in our large intestine or our colon. And this community has a really nice relationship with us. If we look after them, they look after us. So for example, if we feed them fiber, that is their absolute superfood. And then they thrive. We have a lovely group of bacteria, yeast, and fungi. They are able to train our immune system and keep it healthy. They make vitamins. They make vitamins like vitamin K and vitamin B12. They extract nutrients from our food. They keep us healthy. And when we feed them fiber, fiber is only found in unprocessed plant foods. They are delighted. They ferment it and they make anti-inflammatory products. So they in turn,
I'll see you in a bit.
They drive down this inflammation and they keep us healthy. This microbiome is also able to switch genes on and off. So actually there's a very beautiful interplay between these three systems. And I mentioned that food is information. So for example, when we have, what happened here? Oh yeah, when we have a lot of saturated fat in our diet. Now, saturated fat is only found in 3 places in any significant amounts. It's found in all animal source food. So it's found in all meat, all dairy, all eggs. And it's also found in palm oil and tropical oil, palm oil and coconut oil. So it's found in animal source foods, palm oil and coconut oil. And what they found is in people who have a lot of saturated fat in their diet, it causes an imbalance in the bugs that live in our microbiome. And those bugs that we start to get a growth in, they produce a lot of inflammation. They drive inflammation and they drive damage to blood vessels. So this is not really something we want to do. We want to drive down the amount of saturated fat we have in our diet. So that is why I mentioned the ghee and, you know, all the milk, butter, the dairy fats, but also palm oil and coconut oil. Other things that drive inflammation are our fried and processed foods. So when we're having that white rice and the fried breads, these are driving inflammation in our bodies. And it isn't just the fat, the saturated fat from dairy that is damaging, dairy and meat that's damaging. It's also the protein, particularly if it is dry cooked. For example, if it's grilled or barbecued, it starts to produce proteins that damage our blood vessels, that make them stiff, that make them trap cholesterol and cause damage to our blood vessels. And also, finally, we know that there are certain things in dairy called microRNAs, and these are normal, so they would have been in breast milk as well, and they're completely natural. So as adults, if we then reintroduce dairy into our blood, into our system, we've seen in animals that they stop the pancreas from working properly and they stop it being able to release insulin. We don't know if the same thing happens in humans, because the difficulty of that measuring that is you have to actually take cells. You have to give a human milk or dairy and then see if their cells stop producing the insulin, if they become damaged. But there is a possibility that that also happens. It happens in a lot of animal models. It's possible that it happens in humans. We don't know for sure. On the flip side, if we fill our plate up with healthy, unprocessed plant foods, there's a whole field called nutrigenomics. And what we understand is there are specific parts of plant foods, like, for example, haldi switches on tumor suppressing genes. Similarly, things like broccoli, cauliflower, they contain something called sulforaphane. They also switch on housekeeping genes. When they did a huge study on people looking at the typical diets they follow, they found that people who follow plant-based diets have genes switched on that help regulate the fats and sugars in their blood. As I mentioned, fiber is an essential superfood for the bugs that live in our microbiome, and that is only found in unprocessed plant foods. And of course, as we know, plants are full of antioxidants, so they drive down this inflammation. So these are all ways in which our bodies use the information that it gets from the outside world, so the foods we eat, and translates it into health outcomes in our bodies. But it's not just food that's information. Exercise is information. So, for example, when we exercise, we switch on genes in our muscles that help regulate the blood sugars and the fats in our blood. So it does much, much more than just using energy. It actually switches on genes in our body that help regulate the sugars and fats in our blood over a longer period of time than just the period we're exercising. When we exercise, we increase blood supply to our bugs that live in our gut, and it keeps them healthy. It creates a really healthy ecosystem because it nourishes them. It provides a lot more nutrients to them. And the other thing we found is when people exercise, we secrete a lot of chemicals into our bloodstream that drive down inflammation. So it isn't just food that's information. It is all of our behaviors that has a much more complex way of keeping us healthy or driving us towards disease. So this study here, it wasn't a study, it was a meta-analysis. So it took a whole group of studies that looked at the impact of lifestyle on people's risk of diabetes or their risk of having complications from diabetes. And they looked at a whole group of studies that had it, each study had to have at least 3 lifestyle practices, including the ones listed here, as well as a few others. 16 of the studies included over 1 million people, and it looked at if they had a healthy lifestyle compared with an unhealthy lifestyle, how likely were they to develop diabetes? And 10 of the studies included over 34,000 people who already had diabetes and whether they went on to develop complications from diabetes. What they found was in those 1 million or so people who didn't have diabetes, the ones who had a healthier lifestyle reduced their risk of developing diabetes by 75%, which is enormous. And in those people who already had diabetes, it enormously reduced their risk of having problems with their heart, of dying of problems with their heart, of dying of anything by 56%, and even cancer mortality by 30-odd%. There is not a single drug to treat diabetes or any cardiovascular disease that has an effect like this. So as a community, we do need to make better food choices. For example, whole grains are the #1 food that all of us, not just our community, but every community needs to eat more of in order to reduce their risk of all chronic diseases. Although we as a community have a wonderful dietary tradition, unfortunately, we're moving, like most of the Western world, toward more processed grains. So rather than having brown rice, we switch to white rice, which isn't a whole grain. It's had the outer layer removed, which has so many of the goodies in it. And then we have things that are very, very processed, like our puffed and flaked rice, puri, and things like this. And these are really starting to increase our risk of having health problems. We need to reduce our fried foods. When we deep fry things, that changes the composition of these foods. That means that we actually not only make them release their sugars very, very quickly, which is quite stressful to our body, to our blood vessels, to our cells, but they actually start to have other chemicals, chemical reactions that happen in them that damage those cells even more than just the release of sugars. The other thing we commonly do in our community is we deep fry things, and we don't want to waste the oil. So we save it, we let it cool, and then we reheat it again. Constantly heating up oil, cooling it and reheating it creates things called trans fats. And these are very, very inflammatory. They drive damage to our blood vessels. So avoid doing this. Consider things like an air fryer, where you don't need to use so much oil and you can get the crispiness of say, cooking with oil. Again, sugary food and drink, this is good for us all really to avoid. It's not really doing any of us any favors. The best thing I can suggest is don't ever buy these things. If they're not in your home, you're less likely to be tempted, and maybe save them for Diwali or something. And they're even then only when you're going to someone else's house, and just have a small piece then. The first thing is try and avoid even keeping them in your own home. The temptation isn't there then. Now, salt, I spoke about this when I spoke about diabetes. Salt itself is not a big issue. The problem really is that it's added to a lot of processed foods. And if you do have high blood pressure, we know that this is something you need to avoid. If you don't have high blood pressure, then adding a bit of salt to your food isn't a big problem, and it's a good thing to do if you have low blood pressure. And finally, the saturated fat. Again, I'll say this again, because this is one of the things that is the most damaging in our foods, because it raises our bad cholesterol. And the worst combination is having insulin resistance and the high cholesterol in our blood. And this is found in all animal foods. So meat, dairy, and eggs. It's found in palm oil, and it's found in coconut oil. So avoid these oils, avoid these foods. So how do we make these changes? I think one of the most important things is a lot of the time, I feel that as a community, we're very accepting of the hand that life deals for us. And I think this is really positive in most situations. But when it comes to our health, I think that we can be a little bit too philosophical. We presume these things are our fate. We feel like we should live for today. But sometimes we need to really balance up the value of having a short-term pleasurable food and a long-term pleasurable life. A life that, if I think about my dad, I think he would have really loved to have done a lot more things with his grandchildren, but he simply, with all the best will in the world, he couldn't do those things. He just didn't have the independence to do those things. And this is not because he made bad choices. We didn't know any better. But now that we're learning more about these things, there's a lot more we as a community can do to preserve our health. And, you know, the earlier you start, before you even have problems, the easier it is to do that. Food absolutely is medicine. So we need to have fewer of these fried, processed, sugary foods and those unhealthy fats, the ghee, the dairy, animal fat and protein, the palm oil and the coconut oil. These are really key in our lives, in our cuisine, that we need to drive down on and increase the wonderful things that we have in our foods. And in particular, the focus needs to be on increasing those whole grains. We need to stop processing those, having the white flours, having the very, very, the puffed rice, the flaked rice, the white rice. These things are no good for us. As a community, we love our food. We have a great cuisine. And so maybe we're happy to make that focus on our food, but there's more to it than that. We need to be holistic. We need to incorporate exercise. I don't know if you as a group are good at this, but certainly in my community here, we don't give enough emphasis to exercise. What's really interesting is, I was talking about insulin acting as a doorman, letting that food into the cells, letting that energy into the cells. Another thing that lets energy into the cells is muscle contraction. It doesn't need insulin, right? That's another way of opening the door to let the energy in. So after you have a meal, take a walk. That will really help push that glucose into your cells and take it out of your bloodstream where it causes damage. We also know that sleep is really, really important. When we sleep, we didn't used to understand much about sleep. It seemed like such a passive thing to do. But now that we understand a lot more, that sleep is a really active anti-inflammatory process. And when we're sleeping, it helps make our cells more sensitive to insulin. So don't shortchange yourself on sleep either. Stress, try and take steps to manage your stress. Exercise improves both our sleep and our stress. So all of these things help build on each other. And of course, our communities are really, really important. We know that they help with stress. They can also cause stress. By and large, the biggest thing we found in research is that being a member of a sort of community where you can share the good things and the bad things in your life is very, very protective for our health. So foster the relationships that we have and foster the communities we have. And finally, I should let you know what happened to my uncle. So back in 2018, so these green bars here are how many big proteins his kidneys were leaking out, right? So our kidneys are like a sieve, and they should be a very fine sieve. And if they are letting through very large proteins, the fact that they're in this orange zone means that they're very leaky. It's a bit like having holes, big gaping holes in a sieve. They're not doing their job. They're damaged, right? And this blue line here was his long-term sugar control. His HbA1c is what we call it. And this was rising and rising and rising over 2 years. And he was really making an effort with his food. He was trying to not have sugary foods. He was trying to improve his diet. After we began our lifestyle intervention, his blood sugars dropped dramatically. And this is whilst he was coming off his diabetes medication. And now these green bars came out of the orange zone. That meant that they had healed. They were no longer filtering great big bulky proteins. These weren't getting through a damaged sieve. They were healed. And the biggest improvement was that in September 2018, he was showing signs of damage to the back of his eyes, which over time could have led to blindness. By February 2020, he showed no signs of damage to his eyes. It had all been reversed, and it remains healthy to this day. Thank you very much for listening to me today. I'd be delighted to take any questions.